So the purpose of Cosmos Unchained, I didn't come up with this name. This was like Adriana came up with it. But the purpose of this is going to be a series, and we're just going to be answering most of the frequently asked questions that people have in the space that, for one reason or another, is still a pervasive question, such as like, well, what's the difference between like Tezos proof of stake and Cosmos proof of stake, and like other major things, like what's the difference between like Polkadot and Cosmos. So that's the idea, and that's what we have you guys, the Brightmans, on to cover in this segment. So it's going to be Tezos versus Cosmos, and we'll do a little bit of intros of the speakers. Maybe you guys want to get started? The Brightmans? Can I call you the Brightmans?
Arthur and Kathleen.
we prefer Arthur and Kathleen, but or alternately bright people, if you want to be a little more inclusive. But yeah, no. So I guess I have a less prolific background, so I'll go first. But yeah, my name's Kathleen Brightman. Arthur and I co-founded the Tezos project together. I say he's the brains, I'm the brawn. I'm
a beauty, she's a beast.
Exactly. In certain contexts. In any case, all that to say, So I graduated from school in 2012. I've worked in a few different spaces. I've written for newspapers. I've also worked out of venture capital funds and hedge funds, and somehow I wound up in pretend internet money. Back in 2016, I left my job at R3 to work full-time on the Tezos project. And I have looked back since, but that's okay. Arthur, by contrast, has his own story and own introduction. So
I do. Hi, my name is Arthur. Let's see. My background is mostly in statistics and originally high frequency trading, robotics, a bit of different thing. I worked on some self-driving cars at Google. I worked, on high frequency trading at Goldman Sachs, this type of things. And then I had a hobby project called Tezos, and then it started becoming bigger and bigger and bigger until the point it just could not be ignored. And so, yeah, I co-founded Tezos with Kathleen, the Tezos project. And mostly, I would say I'm a free electron, and I try to look around the ecosystem, see what's happening, and try to stoke fervor and enthusiasm.
Very nice. Well, welcome, Sunny. Do you want to do a quick intro about yourself, and then I'll go ahead, and then we'll start the questions. Sunny, you're muted.
Oh, cool. Okay, sorry. I muted myself earlier, and then Zoom didn't let me unmute myself. So my name is Sunny, and I work on the Cosmos project primarily. I started work, I got involved with blockchain back in 2015, so, much later than them. But I was back in 2017, I was, really interested in Bitcoin. I was interested in Ethereum. I was working at Consensus for a little bit, and I didn't really do much work at the time that I was there at Consensus, but instead I spent that entire summer just reading white papers and just like really understanding proof of stake. One of the first things I did to really understand it was my friend Nate Rush and we wrote like a blog post called like Thoughts on Tezos, and it was like well timed because it was like I think like a week or two right before the Tezos ICO, and so it got a lot of publicity, and and then part of that process when I was really like understanding proof of stake, I read the Tendermint white paper, and I was just like taken away because I was like, wow, this is so beautiful and elegant and simple. Like I think we can actually like launch this thing like within the year. Turns out we couldn't, but it's a good shot. And so I joined the Cosmos team, dropped out of school to work on it full time, and have been working on it since then for the past 3 years.
So I'll do a quick intro of myself, and my background is in econometrics, and so that's similar to Arthur's background with statistics. And so the crypto economics and governance of public blockchain networks has always been very interesting to me. And so kind of seeing the governance of Bitcoin unfold was just like a live experiment that yeah, that garnered a lot of lessons learned. And so, doing governance in Cosmos now has been an iteration on that Bitcoin process, as we've seen. So yeah, that's a little bit of background about me. I'm working on Cosmos right now and doing the ecosystem development portion of that. And so, yeah, I've been busy at it since 2017 as far as working at Tendermint goes. And yeah, now we're here doing Cosmos Unchained. Okay. We have a 1 hour to 1 hour and a half segment, depending on how long this goes. But this is going to be like a question and answer series. But after that, we're going to open the floor up to the attendees who can, you could either raise your hand if you're an attendee and you have questions, or you could put your question into a chat box if you know where chat is. And if you don't know where you can raise your hand, you hit participants in this Zoom link, and then there's an option for you to raise hand. So that's how you could do that. So yeah, let's get started. Yeah, so Sunny and I started having this this like brainstorming session about what we should ask you, Arthur, and Kathleen. And we thought that it would be interesting to start with like a each of us steel manning the other side's arguments. So it's like you pose as a Cosmos advocate and you explain like the people here are 5 years old about what Cosmos is and what the use case it tackles. And Sunny is going to explain on the Tezos side and ELI5 to people. So let's do that. So who wants to start?
I can go ahead and start. Yeah, so Tezos is this, the goal is to make a proof of stake based blockchain that actually solves a lot of the governance problems that were present in past iterations of blockchains. So, many past blockchains, whether it's Bitcoin or Ethereum, they sort of take this very hands-off approach to governance where they say that, okay, look, nothing in protocol, or like, purely soft governance, there's no, social coordination is all that matters. Like off-chain social coordination, there's no, and what the problem is that this means that there becomes no Schelling point in governance. And this makes it actually very, one, it makes it very difficult to upgrade the protocol in order to adapt to changing needs. And if you don't have, and so this is why you want to build Schelling points into the system, but Schelling points that are reasonably difficult to subvert them. So on-chain governance, it acts as this like sort of Schelling point that's much harder to corrupt than the more Twitter governance that other platforms use. And so that's sort of one of the main selling points of this premise of governance of Tezos. Beyond that, there's other stuff as well, such as, Solidity has all these problems where, it's not a very secure system. Tezos, we use much more functional programming styles that are more secure and will allow stuff like formal verification. We have proof of stake, and it actually runs and works today. And yeah, I think that's the main pitch, I think. Oh, and Tezos are money. That's I guess another one that, maybe. Well, okay, actually, maybe we'll come back to that later. Never mind. You guys go ahead.
Okay, I can do a pitch for Cosmos. So, basically, I would say right now, if you're, you could think that your options are to use a private chain or a public chain. And if you use a private chain, you're going to have complete control. You know exactly what you're doing. You know who your validators are. You don't have to worry about congestion in the network. You don't have to worry about a lot of things. But the problem is that you live in a silo. You're not connected to a global ecosystem. And so you're losing out on much of the benefits of having a global developer community, of having a global set of network, much like you would lose out if you only had a private net as opposed to having an internet. And oftentimes people would think that the counter to that is to say like, well, you use a public blockchain, but a public blockchain basically requires you to give up a lot of control over what you're doing. You basically lose your sovereignty. It means you're going to have to trust other people to validate your chain. It means it's going to go by their rules. It means if the platform changes, it might change on you. It might break your applications, and so you give them a lot of control. And what Cosmos is trying to do is say, well, you don't have to lose this control. You don't have to lose the sovereignty over your chain just because you want to be interconnected in the world. And so what it does is that it creates for you a technology that lets you launch your chain, lets you have the control you would have with a private chain, while at the same time being able to communicate with every other chain of the world. And so it creates this networks of this network of like semi-private, semi-open public network. It can be as open as you want. So it basically puts the application developers in control of the chain they're going to have and how they interact with the rest of the world.
Okay, and now we have time for rebuttal. And so if anyone got anything wrong during the ELI5, this is the time to rebut or correct the other person.
You guys can go first.
Yeah.
Yes.
Arthur, do you want to?
Well, you had a rebuttal, but
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess most of the way that Sunny framed it was that Tezos does this instead of this. I would point back to the fact that the Tezos white paper is from 2014 and anticipates a lot of the problems that arose. It doesn't react to them, and I think fundamentally what I'm proud of with Tezos is that it's a very principled approach to anticipating what is systemically wrong with blockchains as they were conceived, and so it isn't so much like. It isn't as reactive as I think the Steelman is framed, but that's okay. I think, for the most part, that's correct. I think of Tezos as more of a means to an end, to be like a quick second mover in adopting technologies and forming a coherent and legitimizing way for upgrades to be coordinated.
yeah, I think I would say that the way I would try to frame it more, it's not some, so part of it is like, yes, you want to have a formal process for governance as opposed to informal process for governance. But I think the better frame is to think of it as you want to have, how do you get some things that can be technologically up to date while having very, very strong norms about what the protocol does without, the protocol being changed willy-nilly. And the idea is that you can either have very, very strong norm about what your protocol is, which is what Bitcoin does, or you can have very, very strong norm about how your protocol evolves. Yeah. And Tezos choose to do the latter.
Mm. Right, and as we've seen with Bitcoin, it's very hard to do any sort of governance change over even the matter of like years. So, actually, just curious, how long does it take for some protocol change to occur on Tezos?
So today, the fastest you could go would be about 3 months from proposal to enactment. But that can be changed. Of course, the governance process is self-amending. So.
Okay. Let's see. Sunny?
Yeah, I would say that mostly what they said was about correct. I would say that it doesn't necessarily have to be private chains per se. I think there is a spectrum between private and public, and even things that I would call very much public, but probably still should be on their own chain. So, the classic example I like to give is that there's probably very little reason for Maker to be on Ethereum, where really the Maker system is actually getting almost no security from Ethereum, because if you wanted to attack it, you could either attack the layer it's operating on, which is Ethereum, or you can attack the governance token. And if you could attack the governance token, you could basically corrupt the entire system. And so it's really not getting any security from Ethereum, but it ends up, paying a lot to Ethereum. And gets nothing in return. And so that's an example where, I think there's this article from Paul Storsk, from years ago, where he has this thing called "All Smart Contracts Are DAOs," and I think I misunderstood that article for a very long time. But now that when I reread it recently, I think it actually clicked to me. Where I disagree. Not all smart contracts are DAOs. Like Uniswap is a great example of something that actually is not a DAO whatsoever. But almost most smart contracts end up looking very much like DAOs. So whether it's Augur, if you want to attack Augur, you just got to attack the rep token. If you want to attack 0x, you just got to attack the 0x token. And so this premise, if proof of stake chains are DAOs, and so for most cases where you want a DAO, that's controlling some sort of state machine, it probably makes sense to put it on its own chain. And so yeah, that I guess is one of the main differences, where it doesn't necessarily have to be for private chains, but it's for any chain that has a more specialized stakeholder set.
So the thing I don't get about Maker being on its own chain is that Maker needs collateral, and the only way you can control ETH collateral is by being on the Ethereum chain.
But that's why, that's where things like IBC come in, where, you can IBC over Ether. And yes, the thing is like, okay, yeah, but then, the amount of collateral you have can't be greater than the value of MKR if MKR is securing that IBC connection. But that's already true in Maker. If you can't have the value of all the collateral in the MakerDAO system be greater than the value of MKR anyways.
I would say, for some security arguments, yes, but I think that's the attacks are more subtle than that. I mean, there's thresholds, there's constraints, there's a lot of things that constrain an attack, and I know the argument. If you take this argument all the way, you'll have things like, well, you cannot expect a transaction on, say, Bitcoin to be finalized until more has been paid in block reward than the value of your transaction or something like that. But in practice, that's not what the threshold is, and I would say the same for MKR.
Could you describe what you mean there?
The full value of MKR can be lower than the amount of collateral that's being because bugs aside, which they do have. Bugs aside, in principle, even if you have all of MKR tokens, you can still trigger global settlement, and so you don't get to steal all the collateral. I mean,
you can also screw with the oracles and destroy all the DAI, right? But, you could do more than just trigger a global settlement. In MKR, you could if you have enough MKR, you can change the oracle feed, and that you could actually destroy. You can print by doing that. There's all these weird attacks you could do where you can mint DAI out of thin air.
Well, they have this emergency oracle, which basically are not really oracles. I was reading through it and I thought it's an oracle used in case of emergency, but no, it's an oracle for the fact that there is an emergency. That's what the oracle represents, and that trigger global settlement. But and the thing I don't like is they view global settlement as costless, but it's not costless. You trigger global settlement, you force a lot of people to realize capital gains. That's the cost.
Yeah.
Or if you have a long-term contract with someone that's written in DAI, for example, then all of a sudden, it's not as bad of a cost as stealing all the collateral, obviously, but it's still not something that's costless for people using the system.
So the premise that you have the reasons you believe that you want on-chain strong voting governance at the base layer of Tezos, do you think that argument also applies to almost every DApp on chain?
I mean,
should Uniswap also have the strong on-chain governance that Tezos does?
Well, the curse of course is that I'm not a big DApp believer. So looking at the development of Tezos, it really starts primarily as a cryptocurrency. And then I look at, you look at Bitcoin script and you say well, Bitcoin script is kind of complicated and it's very, it's limited. There's a lot of frustrating limitations in what you can do and cannot do. It would be better to replace Bitcoin script with a small typed stack language that, you can easily write a small program in. If you want to write multi-sig and so on and so forth, you can write it. And that's basically the idea behind Tezos, not running these large dApps. But somehow the curse is that if you have a smart contract platform that can write dApps, then somehow people are going to judge you based on DApp, saying oh, well, it means you need to have the apps with the token and so on and so forth. And I'm okay, maybe, but I don't fundamentally, aside from a few exceptions, and we've mentioned Augur and we've mentioned MakerDAO, and apart from that, I don't think there's a lot of interesting dApps to build.
What about Uniswap? Let's take a very specific example.
Like you say, Uniswap is almost not a DApp in the sense of it's a it's so much more automatic than this. And so all the dApps I basically I think the good thing to do is to basically put them at, over time, just migrate them at the protocol level, just have your protocol handle it.
So my question though is currently as we speak, Uniswap is in this process of migrating from V1 to V2, and basically liquidity providers have to and anyone who's pointing their software at Uniswap has to manually remove it. Do you think that should have? Do you think that was a problem, and do you think that should have been addressed in the Uniswap protocol, where that kind of like Tezos, where it has a built-in upgrade path?
No, I think it's better the way they did it. I think you need to minimize governance. Tezos is not as governance, not because it's great, but because the alternative is either stagnation or hard fork based governance. But if I could, if I could wave a magic wand and just have the best technology, if I knew exactly hey, this is a technology that's going to be used 20 years from now, could we just use that? I would just use that and not have any governance. I think that the point of governance is leaving room for the unknown. But in the case of Uniswap, it's not particularly hard to migrate by saying hey, okay, point to this next contract, remove your liquidity from this one, put it there. There's an migration path, and so I think it would be far worse if somehow they had some governance layer.
So the difference is that in Uniswap, if there's two Uniswaps running in parallel, it's okay if liquidity providers migrate one by one. But in Tezos, if there's a hard fork, there's more of a coordination required that everyone needs to go to the new one or no one needs to go to the new one. Is that sort of where you draw that line?
Yeah, exactly. And even in Tezos, there's a big effort is made to really apply governance strictly to what is strictly needed. And so, for example, it does the vote and the governance procedure only applies really to the state machine. It does not apply to the network protocol. You can speak any language you want on the network. You can exchange packets in the way you want. It doesn't apply to the peer-to-peer layer. It doesn't apply to and so there's a lot of I would say most of the work in building Tezos is in basically defining the frontier between what constitutes the state machine and what constitutes a shell that exchanges messages. And if you read the papers, it's a simple definition of that frontier that says you see operations and then you apply operations, you get a new state. That's a very, very simple thing. But if you want to implement that efficiently, it's a leaky abstraction, right? You need to have. You need your state machine to export a few constants. It's very useful if your state machine exports. This is the maximum size of a block, for example, because you don't want. Is
consensus protocol in state machine or out of state machine?
In the state machine.
Okay. So what's really out of it? Just the P2P network?
The P2P network and the reorganization of the chain. Okay. So what the protocol tells you is basically you send the protocol different chain and the protocol tells you this is the best chain. This is a canonical chain. And then this is a state that the protocol is in. That's what it does.
Okay. So, I see. I'm going to play the role of fish out of water right now because I'm actually a Tezos newbie. I want to go back to the part where you talk about Tezos not being the, VM for all these different dApps like Ethereum is. Because that was actually my a newbie conception of what Tezos did because in the market, speculators talk about how Tezos is the ETH killer with it's ETH with proof of stake.
The only people who talk about ETH killers, as far as I can tell, are Ethereum maximalists. They're the only people I've ever heard say ETH killer. All this so-called ETH killer. You're the one calling them ETH killers,
Huh. I see.
I think that reeks of insecurity when they say that. It's a little amusing, but.
So Tezos is not meant to be a platform for many different applications, like decentralized apps to be hosted on?
I mean, we can't really control who builds on the open source software, but we can tell you what we've been thinking about for the last 5 years. and it's pretty firmly trying to be money, right? And not so much being a DApp store or whatever other, I guess, image has been conjured.
I think you don't want to close doors that you don't have to, that if you don't like firmly have to close them. And if the world, looks like If it turns out that blockchains are primarily used for running dApps and so on and so forth, well, that's great.
To dismiss that. But I think, it's if you read the position paper, which I think the network holds pretty true to in terms of like reflecting the values that are stated, it's definitely the case that like the end goal is not to like be some sort of center that like has applications running on top of it. It's meant to like fold innovation into the protocol in a legitimizing fashion. And so like that leaves a lot of room for experimentation at other parts of it, but it's very much talking over and over again about being good digital money.
The analogy I take is that if you look at cryptocurrencies as a form of digital gold, you can look at like dApps as a form of digital jewelry, in a sense of like, it's nice to have a jewelry industry, that's, because the jewelry industry uses gold. And so it's great, but ultimately what makes the value of gold is not a jewelry demand, but it's, but it's totally fine if it's there. It's great if it's there, but it's not, I don't think it's going to be the dominant focus for these networks in the future.
And I think it's a relatively recent change in the Ethereum narrative too. So it's kind of like a recent phenomenon that sprung up in like 2017, 2018, mostly with, I guess, the ecosystem of projects coming off of the Ethereum chain and doing fundraising on that. So, they had to kind of justify narrative some way or another. I think if you go back to like when Tezos was created, it's very much in the time of, there were new innovations that were coming to the fore. People were bootstrapping new networks in order to instantiate these innovations. We thought that was kind of silly. We thought, wouldn't it be better if you were just able to fold these innovations into the protocol and make, I guess, build on the network effects that these existing protocols had, right? So that's very much like the spirit of what we're coming in from, not necessarily like, oh, look, we can have this base layer that has all these applications running on top of it. Wouldn't that be great? Though, again, like we've been wrong about enough things, and I think like the Tezos position paper, leaves room for applications. It just like wasn't in the it wasn't what inspired the project, and so it's kind of like a very interesting goalpost to be measured against, because it's very clearly not what we had in mind when the software was being built.
So when you explain it that way, what I'm thinking of is like the innovations that come out of the space, such as like, I don't know, zero knowledge proofs or scaling mechanisms, like rollups or BLS signatures or whatever it is, that gets folded into the protocol, but not necessarily having like a specific decentralized app that is hosted on your chain.
I mean, I think there can be a lot of decentralized apps that can be hosted on the chain, and I think if people want to do that, that's completely fine. I honestly think a lot of these things are going to move to layer 2 for many DApps. It makes sense to, maybe run some chain and then checkpoint it or use the shared security from the main chain. Maybe it makes sense to use something like Plasma. Maybe it makes sense to use something like state channels. I think that's for a lot of cases, that's fine. A lot of reasons you see like dApps on chain is frankly out of convenience, because it was easy for people to open up a Solidity editor and write something. And I don't think that those people are necessarily going to start saying like, oh, I know, I'll write it for a shard and I'll deal with all the shard communication issues. I don't think we're going to see that. And it's also, look, you pay an enormous cost for these blockchains. They're complicated. They're slow. Even the fast, high throughput one, they're still like compared to a centralized solution, they're very, very slow. And so you're buying something, and primarily what you're buying is censorship resistance. And the question is like, who's trying to censor you? And there's a lot of very, very valid reason to be concerned with censorship, but a lot of so-called DApps are not really, are not particularly at risk of censorship, and so it doesn't.
Kitties need to be censorship resistant.
Yeah, absolutely, because someone's gonna steal your kitties. I think there's something more to it. I don't think that CryptoKitty. I think that CryptoKitty would lose what it is if it were completely centralized, but I also don't think it needs to be like hosted on on the main chain on layer 1. I don't think that makes a lot of sense.
I mean, we could even look at like my construction for Coast is like very much using just the economics of a game that we're building and putting it on the blockchain and not like making every transaction, posted to the blockchain because it's just not necessary. So I don't think there's been a lot of introspection as to what is sort of the value add of a blockchain in a fair number of projects. But that's okay. It's a very nascent field. So
yeah.
So quick question. So just so if I understand it correctly, so when you talk about like, incorporating these things back into the core protocol, like going back to the maker example, let's say I wanted to relaunch a maker like over collateralized stablecoin on Tezos, which as far as like Arthur, I think you're working on something like that, but
if you want to help,
good person to ask.
But as I explained, the Cosmos approach would be that, I want the MKR to split off onto its own chain and do its own thing on a new chain. But it seems like in Tezos, you would rather have Tezos governance, like the base on-chain governance also be the governance token for the maker system as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think you want to minimize governance in a system like this. And so maker use governance for a lot of things. In Checker, I got it down to basically one thing, which is periodically changing an Oracle feed if you need to change an Oracle feed. That's basically it. The adjustment, stability fee adjustments, a lot of these things can just be handled automatically, to be honest. And I think they're better off being handled automatically than having all this governance. And for that, I think you can put that in the hands of the bakers. You can even put the Oracle itself in the hand of the bakers. There's been proposed system where every single block you just post an Oracle feed, you medianize that, and you get something decent. I think there's also designs for. I used to think it was not possible. I now almost know it's possible, although extremely. It would be a huge gas machinery, but you could do a purely intrinsic stable coin without any Oracle. Because there are some interesting, the intrinsic thing you can measure is the total amount that locked in CDPs. And the larger this amount is, the more stable the thing is. Because if it's very large, it means you have a lot of people willing to hold it and you have a lot of people willing to borrow in it. And if that's the case, then it means in some sense that you have something that's stable.
So in there's this common thing going on in the traditional tech world right now, which is this battle between platforms versus aggregators. And so in the blockchain space, you could see Ethereum sort of as a platform where it's just building this base layer for a lot of people to build stuff on top of. And Binance is actually considered they're an example of someone who's going for a complete vertical integration aggregator play. They want to aggregate all the services into one platform. Would it be fair to call Tezos sort of a decentralized aggregator play where it's not trying to be a platform like Ethereum, it's trying to go for a full vertical integration kind of like Binance, but in a decentralized way?
I would separate Tezos and how Arthur thinks Tezos might win, because those are very, very different. Those are very different things. The protocol is the protocol is basically going to host what people want to host on it, and we're going to do what people want to do with it. I think that.
Sure, but what are your thoughts?
But if I had to, if you tell me conditional on Tezos winning in the next 10 years, what do you think happened? And I don't think it won because it had all of these DApps and everyone wants to run serverless Web3 application, and somehow that all ran on Tezos. It's possible, and I certainly do not want to close that door, but it's not the most likely win scenario. I think it's now, to answer directly your question, I'm not sure exactly what you mean for Binance and the aggregators, because what Binance is doing with their chain basically is that they're integrating. I don't follow Binance closely, but I think they integrate their chain closely with their exchange, and they try to tokenize all of these other products on their chain and build a big DEX chain.
They just want to basically provide anything you want to do with crypto. They want to be the portal to do it. So, they are now doing exchange. They have their own stable coins. They have their own smart contracting chain. They have they bought coin market cap. So now if you want the information about cryptocurrencies, basically they're it's a vertical integration is what I'm talking about. Like they're vertically integrating the entire crypto space under their company. Would it be fair to say Tezos is trying to do a vertical integration of decentralized money all under this one governance base layer?
I think you can do both. If you take the image, which is limited in many ways, but if you take the image of the App Store, for example, like where it be the Android App Store or the iOS App Store, it's like it's a platform. There's a ton of apps, but as an Android user, a lot of the apps that I end up using are basically Google provided. It's a default email app. It's a default SMS app because it's a suite. Yeah. It works well as each other and so on and so forth. So I think you can do both. I do think I just think there's a lot of things which are kind of, so you don't want to be more coupled than you need to be. So if you have domain name systems that work well as a smart contract level, you don't necessarily need to move them to the protocol level. Maybe you'll save a little bit on gas, but what else are you going to do? There's a natural tendency in all ecosystems to kind of standardize around certain dApps and to kind of follow a certain pattern. So in some sense, you get this decentralized aggregation from the fact that the canonical non custodial stablecoin on Ethereum is DAI. Yeah, that's what it is, and it may have some competitors, and so there's a benefit in like leaving it open to competitors as opposed to saying like, no, this is it. And I don't know that they would somehow gain a lot by just like making it somehow more tightly integrated. But I do think there are. No, sorry, I keep giving you like the boring centrist answer because I'm not entirely sure. I think it's a wait and see. You wanna have competing things on your platform and then strategically decide how tightly you want to integrate them.
Yeah.
The way I'm kind of imagining it in my head is there's currencies that are controlled by the government, and then there's like local currencies. So like I've been spending a lot of quarantine time watching Pawn Stars. Do you guys know what that is?
No, enlighten us.
Pawn Stars.
Pawn Stars.
So Pawn Stars, yeah, like we follow a pawn shop owner, and then he's just making deals. And so there's this one special where they just talk about ancient coins. And so one of the coinage was this guy brings a coin from the Roman civilization, and it was this very plain coin, and what it was this brothel coin. So it was an altcoin. It was a shit coin, and in order for it to have any worth, you had to convert it back into a Bitcoin or like the Roman currency at the time. By itself, it was worthless. And so what people did when they went to the brothels was they had to convert their government's currency over to this brothel coin in order to receive the service, and then the employees at the brothel then would have the currency, and then that would have like one-on-one parity with the recognized currency, and then that's when they exchange it over for some sort of value. And so when Arthur talks about altcoins and decentralized apps being the jewelry of digital gold, that's what I kind of think of. And when you say that not any of them needs to have their own governance structure to govern it, it's like the brothel coin didn't need an entire like governing system to like supply that coin, but it was like the currency itself had like its own governance. And so what I'm thinking with this is that the Tezos looks like a currency, like a governed currency, whereas like with Binance they have they're trying to do internet and currency and internet and everything else at the same time.
So
with like Binance as the governing body.
I'm curious as to, first of all, why is it with brothel coin? I mean, I know they're casino chips, right? That sounds like a casino chip. You buy your casino chip at the end.
Yeah.
You play with a casino chip. So I'm not sure why they had brothel coins as opposed to just using the Roman currency directly.
Oh, sorry. It had to do with regulation. So they it was outlawed to have the emperor's face on a coin in order to transact for that kind of a service, and so they had to use like an alternative coin, so to speak.
Yes. Form of a substance.
I'm not sure we're going to steal that analogy, but
it's funny. There's like there's also a proverb that comes from a Roman emperor, which is like money has no smell. When they started collecting taxes on the public toilets in.
Oh.
Well, so those were shit coins as well, I guess.
They're literal shit coins.
the first ones.
I mean, you said like, oh, Binance will give you whatever you want to do with cryptocurrencies, and right now people are doing a lot of things with this. But if we try to protect ourselves in the future, the things that will survive are, I think, the thing which really play to the strengths of being in a blockchain as opposed to being in a centralized platform, and these are fundamentally going to be censorship resistance, being a hard to seize store of value, this type of things, and if Binance doesn't provide that, they're not going to compete with that. Now, I think Binance provides something that is very present, that exists today in the cryptocurrency space, but I wouldn't necessarily expect to last for a very long time.
So, question: when you talk about you see the goal of Tezos is to be money, could you explain a bit about what that means more specifically? And what do you money is this very vague term. What do you even mean by that?
So it's not the goal of Tezos, and it's not the goal of Tezos because they're not sentient being.
Sure.
It's like I think of them as that's my deck. And if someone else wants to think of Tez as I don't know as mystical amulets that can align the stars for them, then by all means align the stars with your Tez token. That's
Wait, before you answer that question, I'm gonna frame this conversation brings me to another point, which is in the U.S. we have this we talk a lot about what the framers of the U.S. Constitution, what their intent was when writing the Constitution, and that directs a lot of our ways we try to interpret the U.S. Constitution is by assuming the intent. And so in a way, would you say that you two are the framers of the Tezos Constitution, and thus is your intent when you design the systems important in how we interpret the goals?
No, and that's why I keep giving you all this caveat about the fact that it's intention, because I don't want this to be I don't want this to take on the framers wanted this and this and that. It's I deliberately there's a flavor that I have, but it is not the flavor of the chain itself.
Well, also, I think founder worship has crippled the space more than anything else, and so we try to be very neutral in our tone, while also having opinions. I don't know. Yeah,
it's also the case. I remember during the block size debates, is all these Satoshi hermeneutics saying clearly. Here, Satoshi said peer-to-peer payment system, cash. So it means that he wants this and that. But look, this one time in this forum, he said something about the block size in one way and another. And what I find truly fascinating about that is that none of this was about Satoshi's a very smart guy, obviously, because he came up with this entire thing, and so clearly we should have some deference towards what they were thinking because they were really, really strong thinkers and so on and so forth. But this is not what this is about. All of this discussion was about what did they intend, because we somehow have a moral duty to follow the intent of the of the founder. Right. And I think what you do in Tezos is you replace that with a governance mechanism that's explicit.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have to have these questions.
It's the practice of Jesus's followers trying to interpret his gospel through through the word of the Bible or something.
Well, so the fun is, I guess it depends on the different branch of Christianity, and the most I think the most governance centric one would be the Catholics, because they have this very, very explicit, very hierarchical structure, and say how do we interpret the world of God? Well, there's a whole hierarchy, and then this is a procedure, very, very super codified.
Yeah. yeah, as a lapsed Catholic, this all rubbed me the wrong way. In any case,
I mean, there's just so many parallels, between the forks and the
Holy
schisms
Wars,
and
yeah. Offshoots that are very unsuccessful.
burning the
Anyway,
heretic.
so to the question about like, so from your personal viewpoint, why do you guys think that Tezos are money, and what do you even mean by that?
I mean, I think primarily the best, the best thing that the best chance for this network to survive is to function as a store of value, because if they're just technology, so mere technology platform can be for it, right?
Mhm.
If all you're doing is, corralling a set of computers which are going to compute something, right? If all you're doing is compute, then the value of compute is very, very cheap. The amount of processing power you need to host an application is tiny. You're talking a few dollars on AWS. So it's not something that's going to be able to buy you crypto economic security on a chain. And so if you're just seeing this purely as a way to host application, to do compute, it's not going to get you anywhere. So where does your crypto economic security comes from? And the two answers to that is they are, so let's go with three answers, sorry. One answer is there's going to be a lot of fee paying in the network where gas, and because all these fees are going to be paid in this currency, is going to create demand for the currency, and that's going to create values, that's going to create economic security. It's the Ethereum proof of work model. I don't think that works because a fee fundamentally is something between you and a miner. It doesn't have to be paid in any currency. And that has nothing to do with whether or not it's enabled in the protocol. Like you could have a long-term service agreement with a miner and say, I'm going to wire you US dollars and incorporate my transaction in your feed. So that doesn't...
You've actually built this into the Cosmos Hub like protocol itself, where you can pay fees in any token you want.
Well, with staking, it's different. So the benefit of staking is that with staking, by holding a staking token, you hold a claim on how many blocks you can produce. So other people in the network will let you produce those blocks, and as a result, you have a scarce resource, which is just how much gas or how much transactions can go on a network. So there is a case to be made with staking token, but it is still uncertain, especially if we start having scaling solutions which allows the capacity to grow enormously, especially if you start doing things like sharding, for example, or having multiple chains, and all of a sudden it's like, well, it's great, but really there's an overabundance of computing resources. And right now we have to deal with the fact that blockchains don't scale, but over time, the better they scale, basically the closer the value of these apps are going to come down to the cost of compute, and that may not buy you crypto economic security. And the thing that's left essentially is being a store of value. And if you're a store of value means of payments, which is basically the one use case that's really been proven for cryptocurrencies, then you can have your crypto economic security. And so I think it's just the most viable way of surviving.
But what does it mean to like say this is going to be a store of value? Or like, can you just say like by fiat, I declare this asset a store of value? Like people have to agree that it has value for some reason, right?
Well, that's just, that's a saying that if you look at the Goldman Sachs report on Bitcoin, they said like, oh, this, it only works on like someone wanting to buy it from you, and the same is true for gold, with putting jewelry aside, like the staking in a transaction is jewelry, but it's not a big driver. Currencies and store of values are largely circular. Like there's some minimum requirements, right? If this thing doesn't work, if you can't transact in it, if somehow it just like gets completely diluted and you can't really use it, and that doesn't work. But as soon as you have a few characteristitic, it becomes these very, very circular things. It could be cigarettes in a prison. Sometimes you have like the cigarettes in a prison have something that bootstraps them, which is they're somewhat valuable, but then they can take on a store of value aspect, which goes way beyond what you would use them for directly. The example I like to give is if you look at again, let's look at gold. So I haven't followed the price of gold. Last I checked, it was around like $1,200 a troy ounce, and last I checked, silver, it was around $20 a troy ounce. It's probably different now. It's going to be in that ballpark. What is the industrial demand for gold? So it's good for, it's corrosion resistance, it's good in electronics, it's good in many ways, but it's not much better than silver. Silver corrodes a little more easily, but not much better. and you can do alloys as well that will do very well. So it's not much better than silver. Now it's used in jewelry, but the main reason it's used in jewelry is because it's a store of value. It's not the case that's like, oh my, gold is a store of value. It's too bad because it's so convenient for making jewels. No, you're making jewels out of gold because you're literally wearing money. You're saying like, look, I can afford to take this very rare material in order to do my jewelry. It may have started because it was ductile, but at the end of the day, it's also because of that. And so if you remove the history of the gold as store of value, if you just look at it purely from an industrial perspective, it's hard to argue it should be worth a lot more than silver. And so you're looking, maybe it would be like $20 an ounce, $30 an ounce. And silver also has a monetary component. So if you're looking at like what drives the value of gold, besides, being a completely circular store of value, it's like, well, for historical reasons, I know other people are going to value it. It's like a few dollars out of thousands of dollars. It's like when people talk about the interesting value of gold, that's what I would call the interesting value. And it's like a fraction, maybe a fraction of a % of the value of gold, probably.
Sure. So I get this. I agree that gold, I think a lot of it comes from being this shelling point game where all of the financial world agrees we're going to use this as this inversely correlated asset, and it's this game. That's what gives it the value.
Yeah.
Today, at least. But so my question though, what I'm trying to get at is, in Cosmos, in the Cosmos Hub, our team at least, we try to be very clear and tell people that oh, atoms are not money, and these things should be treated as the analogy that we like to use is virtualized ASICs, that they're this capital asset that you need to have in order to be able to validate this chain. And if you're validating the chain, you get some, and ASICs have some value to them.
Yeah. My
question is, what, other than the way that we're pitching it, what makes Tezos different than atoms? Why are they a store? What makes them more of a store of value than atoms are?
I mean, it's like asking other than perception, what makes something more of a store of value than something?
So do you think that we should start pitching atoms as money?
Yes, but there are also concrete differences. So there's the fact that you do require a lot of atom to be staked for the system to work, and that doesn't work if you're not going to get the velocities that you need if everything is staked. It makes it harder to be it makes it a little harder, I think, to be money or to be a store of value.
But isn't 60-70% of Tezos also staked?
Nope, it's less than 10%.
Really?
Yeah.
What? Wait, does that include? Wait, does that
delegated?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Okay, but if it's delegated, that's still locked and not usable.
No, it's not. No.
So I can oh, there's no right. Okay, so there's no unbonding period for delegated.
Yeah.
Here's the problem that I have with proof of stake token, staking tokens that are intended to be store of value, and it's because if you have this inflationary asset, then I guess it acts as cash, right? But not necessarily like gold, in that the supply is currently being mined, right? So it's an inflationary asset in the sense that the Fed has an inflation rate of 2% a year, and then it's coming into the market. And the other thing is with on-chain governance, as I guess liberal as Tezos, in comparison to Bitcoin's governance, in theory, wouldn't changing the inflation rate or the supply, it can happen, and so if Tezos governors, bakers decided to be act as the Fed, so to speak, then they could own the supply and distribution of Tezos, as opposed to like Bitcoin. It's just my trust in Bitcoin is that there will never be more than 21 million coins in existence, and that is kind of the perception that I have, that this is a store of value. Mm-hmm. Whereas if there's governance, liberal governance, then I get kind of antsy, what do you?
I get that. So a couple of things. First, if you look at them, being inflationary, right now the inflation in Tezos is lower than the typical reward you would get for delegating, and so net, it's actually deflationary, whereas Bitcoin is inflationary right now. So that's, I think, you have to look at the balance. You have to look at basically like staking reward minus, or delegating reward minus inflation. And that's going to make that's a number you want to look at. The second thing is the governance in Tezos is not liberal by any means. If you want to adopt something, you need to pass, it's over a period of 3 months, you need to pass 2 votes, and you need to have an 80% supermajority in every vote. This is not...
Yeah, that is a detail we omitted at the beginning. It's not just about time, it's also about like a threshold, right? And that's
yeah. So it is not liberal by any means. It's like, it is very, very constraining, and it is meant to be constraining. And in fact, the constraints can be added over time. You can have constraint in the protocol says like, reject any future version of the protocol which doesn't have this aspects. And in fact, one way of implementing a hard cap, if one wanted to implement a hard cap, we can do this in code. We can do this we can say, no matter what proposal is made, even if the proposal is voted, if the proposal is done in a way that the code doesn't goes over a certain limit, then reject it. And you can even do that programmatically. It's not like a social consensus. You can programmatically detect that something is going to go over that limit or not.
And you could also do what the US does with an amendment process and say like, oh, unless in the future, of course, 95% of people reject this, constraint. Like you can make it more complicated if you want to, but I think
that code can still be changed.
Pardon?
Right?
So yeah, let me ask you this. Like in between the time it takes a core developer to implement the change into code, and between that code getting proposed for a governance for a governance process to vote on, how difficult or easy is that? Because again, if I tie it back to Bitcoin, it would be like the core developers could implement some change like right then and there and say, okay, we're going to hard fork in 22 million coins, and then but the miners who are completely separate would never go for that, I presume. So how more constrained is the Tezos process than it is for the Bitcoin process where governance is not so explicit?
So the Bitcoin miners are going to go after whichever branch has the most value. That's what they're going to do. And the branch that has the most value is a branch that's going to be seen as legitimate. And so the only thing that determines what happens to the Bitcoin protocol and a hard fork is perceived legitimacy. It's not miners. It's not user activated hard fork, soft fork, or anything like that. All of these factors, insofar as they influence some things, they only influence the Schelling point. And the question is, what is going to be the Schelling point? And if the new Bitcoin Schelling point is 22 million coin, then markets will follow, then miners will follow, then users will follow. Oh, I'm sure that there's some hardcore people who will say oh, I only want to use Bitcoin, which is 21 million coin, and so what? They'll use something that no one else is using. Now, of course, I think it's very unlikely that the Schelling point happens to move from 21 million coin to 22 million coin because it's so culturally ingrained. So there's a very strong cultural norm around it, but that's all there is.
Right.
This is all of these things are this is open source code. This can be forked. All of these things are enforced by Schelling points, but so many things are enforced by Schelling points. Even things where we think in terms of power and violence are enforced by Schelling points. So let's say you're a dictator, right? And you have armed guards. Why is no one, and everyone hates you, for example. Well, why is no one, attacking the dictator? Well, because they will be shot by the guard. Well, why would the guard shoot them? Well, because if the guard knows they don't shoot them, then they're going to be shot by the other guard. And so at the end of the day, what is the power of dictator? It just happens to be in the middle of a nice Schelling point equilibrium where it's costly for anyone to defect from this equilibrium and to try to attack them. And that's what protects this protocol. It's purely Schelling points. It's not miners. Miners do not defend the Bitcoin, the integrity of the Bitcoin protocol. That's nonsense.
So is the Schelling point for Tezos, am I correct in saying that for a lot of the Tezos protocol, the idea is that the Schelling point is to go with what on-chain governance says? Is that correct or no?
Yes.
Okay.
There's a document a
Yeah.
blog post that I wrote a while back, which was like the general principles and values of the Tezos network, which tries to address this question of like trying to set some shilling points around like, hey, what should we do?
Mhm.
Because obviously, if the governance process somehow were hijacked or like yielded a completely like crazy results, then you don't want to follow. You want to follow things to their natural conclusion, but not to their absurd conclusion. So obviously, the priority is you want to survive, and not just like box yourself. There's a poll that I really like, which is you ask people who like proof of work maximalist, saying like how long of a reorganization of the Bitcoin chain would you think is acceptable before wanting a hard fork?
Yeah.
And there are some people who will answer, and I don't believe them, but they who also like no matter how long, it doesn't matter. Even if I
Yeah.
see a reorganization of the Bitcoin chain to the from the Genesis block, we should never do anything about it.
Yeah. No,
It's an easy position to have because it's not, it just would not happen. It just would not happen
Yeah.
that they would take this position. But so there are absurd conclusions, and the fact that you can have a hard fork is actually useful. Like you want to be able to bootstrap yourself out of a bad situation if it happens. It's a safety valve, but it's a last resort.
So one of the, I was talking to one of the engineers from TQ, and I can't remember his name, unfortunately, but he was explaining to me this observation that you can't hard fork Tezos because, let's say the governance process gets corrupted and 51% of Tez, whatever it is, 81% of Tezos say to do something. And then the minority fork, they fork off. But the problem is that 81% still has the coins on the new fork, and they could just keep pushing the same upgrade again and again and again and never let anyone fork off. Is that like a legitimate concern?
I mean, so there was a hard fork of Tezos, and obviously one of the first things they did is they killed the governance and made it centralized, so that they would avoid this problem.
But does that?
I think we have to concede that like maybe it's an experiment at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And not all experiments go very well. So I think there are some sure signs that maybe we were wrong, and we'd have to like concede that point. But yeah.
So going back to shelling points, that ties into like what the question of what the promise to users you made. Like what was the promise you made users? Because the promise that Satoshi made to users was that this is going to be a 21 million coin supply that is ever going to exist. This is called Bitcoin, and it's supposed to be digital gold. This is the promise, so like therefore it's never going to be changed. So like what is the promise that Tezos made when it was created, and what is the promise that Cosmos made when it was created? Like it's like the holy thing.
No. It's like I think that it's a social contract.
It's a social contract.
The Bitcoin social contract. It is a social contract. I think that I think that Tezos social contract by and large is that it's going to be token holder led governance.
Yeah, right.
For Cosmos, to be honest, I'm actually not sure. I would say me and Jay actually have somewhat conflicting opinions on this, where Jay, I think, leans much more towards sort of token-led governance, token holder-led governance. How I frame Cosmos governance, and I'm not even sure if this is truly a meaningful distinction or not, but how I see it, how I like to phrase it is the token holders are not governing. We're still following a very much more Bitcoin, Ethereum-esque soft governance off-chain, and the token holders are acting like oracles to the social consensus. And it's the on-chain voting is purely a efficiency system where it's it's the easiest way to oracle poll on like the social consensus. But if the oracles tell us something is like incorrectly report the social consensus results, then that's when it's time to fork. And I'm not sure if this is actually, practically there's very little difference in like how that's implemented, but I think it comes down to like we were talking about earlier about perception. I think there's a very different connotation between these two versions.
So I agree that what's happening on chain is mostly ratification. So there's already a decision going to be made, and once you go on chain, you ratify it. And there's already been there's already been some agreement, which is why like sometimes people explain like, oh, what happens if a proposal has like 60% versus like 40%, or if it's closed. I don't think it's oftentimes going to be closed, or if it's closed, then it was a bad proposal. It shouldn't be closed.
Right.
The proposal should happen at a time where there's an overwhelming desire. That being said, I wouldn't say it's not governance in the sense that they're not just oracles for what the social decision might be, because if they were, I don't think any of them would say like, well, I really disagree with this proposal, but my job as an oracle is to make sure I report honestly what I think the social consensus is, and I'm going to report that the social consensus is for it, even though I am against it. So people are expected to report their opinion and not just their perception of the social consensus. It could be that they're already, they've already been won over and they're already like part of that social consensus, but at the end of the day, they still have the power. It's kind of like saying, we're going to have, a ratifying body, but the ratifying body is not going to have any power. Well, yeah, if you are a ratifying body, you do have the power to decide not to ratify something.
Yeah. But so, I mean, put yourself in the role of that's what I'm saying, that maybe that's what should be happening. So if I put myself in the role of a miner in July 2017, like SegWit is coming up, or let's say better one is the 2x one. I was pro 2x, but I think that like if my job as an oracle, and that's what the social contract is for me to be an oracle, I would have signaled that, no, I think the social consensus is saying not to do this, even though I personally do want to do it. And I think that is actually sometimes you should be doing that.
So would you replace a vote with a shelling game, saying like, you lose if you don't predict the same thing that everyone else predicts?
Sure. But then
you're closer to a hard fork, because that's what you're doing in a hard fork. It's like, oh, what branch should I focus on? I'll focus on the branch that I expect other people to take. And you're back with a hard fork type of shelling game. You choose to run the node that you expect the social consensus is going to run.
Yes.
That's my point. It's like, I think what's important in a vote, and the difference between a hard fork, between hard forks with governance and this type of governance, is that it should not be costly for you to express your opinion against.
No, but the difference here is that so everyone's playing this shelling game, but at the end of the shelling game, in a hard fork, the fork happens. But in the voting system, the fork doesn't happen at the end of the shelling game. We reveal the results of the game, and the social contract is the minority goes with whatever the majority said. So we don't get into that system. So it is a bit different, where we don't end up in a fork.
It doesn't matter if the fork happens, because like with few exceptions, most forks in most fork scenario, only one branch dominates. So if you look at Ethereum Classic Ethereum, it's the forks that won, Ethereum won. And the fact that some people are still on Ethereum Classic doesn't, it takes a little bit away from Ethereum, like a few percent, but it doesn't, it doesn't take that much. Same thing with Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin.
Mostly helps them in getting the dollar McIntyres contained, but in any case.
But it doesn't, so in some sense, you can let the fork happen. The problem is not, that's also, I think, a misconception of Tezos. The problem is that you don't want to prevent hard forks. If people are going to hard fork, they're going to hard fork. You don't. That's not the point. The point is to make sure that the canonical hard fork is determined through a procedure that takes into account, what token holders are thinking, as opposed to a shelling game, which can be manipulated.
Okay, so I'm really glad that you brought up the misconceptions topic, because that was actually a question. So like Sunny, so Arthur brought up misconceptions of Tezos. So Sunny, what is a misconception of Cosmos?
Misconception of Cosmos. Okay. I would say, okay, so one is that Cosmos Hub and Cosmos are like the same thing. So I think the vision for Cosmos is very different than the vision for the Cosmos Hub. Personally, I am very, if I had to choose one, like, what am I like a champion of? It's primarily the vision for Cosmos, which is just this ecosystem of interconnecting chains. And the Cosmos Hub, I think, is still kind of has to find its footing, to be honest. I think the initial proposition of the Cosmos Hub as this like chain where what it's going to do is just connect a bunch of chains, I actually don't think that's a very strong value proposition. I think it has some use cases, but I think really if the Cosmos Hub wants to be successful, I think it needs to really focus on things like shared security and basically, or like providing least security to lower security chains that want to sort of lease that security. And I think, so basically like this, not conflating these are almost like sort of two different projects that the same team happens to be undertaking and like, building, and, they are intertwined in some ways, but they're two very different visions, I would say.
Mm. Okay, cool. We're on the hour and 15-minute mark. So we'll do last maybe 10 minutes of what each person is doing, and then we'll open the floor up to Q&A. Yeah. So, the question is just, what are you guys currently working on right now with respect to each of your projects?
Sure. My new company tries to make more efficient secondaries markets using smart contracts. And so we're going into alpha with our first video game this week, which is super exciting. So I've been stressed out on that front.
I do a few things. I look at what's going on in this ecosystem. I try to chat with different engineers in the ecosystem, see what's going on. And one thing I've been working on as well is a thing called Checker, which is a robocoin. It's not a stable coin because it doesn't follow an exact peg because that's impossible, but that's another discussion.
Have you looked at the Reflexor Labs Rye stuff that came out a few days, like last week?
Oh yeah, I've seen it. I've seen the title because because the name Rye, but no, I have not.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I'd just be curious to know if it's like what you were doing is very similar to that or not. So what am I working on? Well, so Cosmos, we're currently actively in Game of Zones, which is our IBC sort of test network of test nets. So we're basically building a Cosmos network, but by connecting a bunch of people's test nets together and like spamming it with IBC transactions and stuff. We may have spammed it a little bit too hard because things kind of fell apart a little bit, but that's the point of having test nets. And so we're currently in the process of, bringing that back up and continuing with that experiment. And hopefully once a lot of these stuff get ironed out, hopefully we'll start to see that on mainnet. I personally am very interested, I've been looking a lot more into how to, I'm interested in DeFi, but I don't like a lot of the DeFi stuff that exists right now. I think that almost like, I think we need more trust systems in DeFi, where I think that trustlessness is not a valuable, shouldn't be the core value proposition of DeFi. I think the world has a lot of trust in it. The problem is not everyone trusts everyone, and we need to be building more web of trust-based systems. That the goal of technology should be to enable transactions that may not have been possible in the past to now be possible by leveraging existing trust relationships. And I think the goal of DeFi should be to focus on openness and transparency. And so I'm kind of working on experimenting with different DeFi stuff down that route.
I have a question for you regarding trust, because one thing I've learned in looking at this space is that there's two very different views of trust that people have. And one of that is that they are a set of honest people that you want to deal with, and there's a bunch of dishonest people. And the problem is that you don't know which one you can trust and which one you cannot trust. And the goal of trust system is, of like something like web of trust, is to know who you can and cannot trust. And it's an information problem. And the other view is that we live in a Hobbesian world, and you cannot, the only times that trust exists is because there are expensive enforcement mechanisms in place and penalty mechanisms in place in the form of governments, in the form of courts. Basically, if you're out of this world, you cannot rely at all on trust, because if people have a way to make money, if people have a way to take your money without repercussion, they will systematically do it.
Yeah, I would fall definitely much more into the first camp, but but I would disagree with the notion that like there is a global set of good actors and a global set of bad actors. I think that I think that bilateral, like social, personal relationships, I think that enforcement actually is the key to it, but I think enforcement doesn't necessarily have to come through like state actors or force, but it can actually just come through like, personal relationships where if you screw me over, I'm not going to trust you in the future, and I'm going to badmouth you to everyone else, and no one else is going to want to interact with you. And so I think that's sort of the point of web of trust systems. So I guess it's somewhere in the middle of the two that you.
Well, if it's permanent information problems, then basically transitivity can work for web of trust. But if it's about like your my close circles, then transitivity is not going to work, and the network effect will be a little lost, because you're like, well, a friend of mine trusts you, and then trusts a person who trusts that person. Like, okay, but they're not. I have no social leverage over that. The other thing I've learned is that you cannot, sometimes you think you can shame the shameless, but you cannot shame the shameless.
That has been our big takeaway from Tezos' project on the non-technical side. So this is a word of caution.
Okay, so we'll do Q&A now. Peter asks, what are your thoughts on blockchain interoperability, IBC, and how it relates to Tezos going forward?
I think that there's a few things that Tezos could do. I think having an IBC client would be interesting, so that you could build one directly and make it send in a smart contract, but having like protocol level support, so that if you have an IBC chain and you want to post your state on the Tezos chain, you could do this. I think that would be interesting. Given the consensus algorithm of Tezos right now, it's not very portable. It's not designed like Tendermint is specifically designed to make it very, very portable, but it also limits the number of validators that you can have. So there's a trade-off. So it's easier to bring things on the Tezos chain than to bring things out of the Tezos chain, which is not necessarily a bad thing. So I think that would be the first step, to do something with IBC.
You tell us a little bit about Tenderbake?
Yeah.
Tenderbake. So Tenderbake is it's a paper that looks at Tendermint. It fixes a few things, like I think there's some potentially unbounded buffers in Tendermint, and so that it solves that. It's a set of tweaks.
You removed the unbonding period?
The which one?
You removed the unbonding period, or what did you mean by?
No. There's unbounded buffers.
Oh, gotcha.
Like there's weird edge cases in Tendermint where you have to potentially store, and you need unlimited memory. It's unlikely, because at some point you're going to get consensus and so on and so forth. But it's cosmetic. But the biggest part is like trying to make it work within the system in Tezos, and that means that as opposed to Cosmos, where you have basically like a set of validators and they're going to validate every block. Trying to do this with a random selection of validators, so that you can you have a sortition basically for the validator set. That's the main difference. And making it work with the Tezos shell, because the Tezos shell has a precise idea of what it expects from a chain. It expects blocks to be proposed, and then and to have their fitness, and it doesn't have this concept of a candidate block. And so there's a way to mock it up by having like pseudo blocks that come in. And so just like integrating it into the machinery of Tezos is a bit of work, and it concerns itself with that. But it is essentially Tendermint with a random set of validator.
In Tezos governance, is there a way of sort of like the Tezos governance process of sort of agreeing that this is a general direction we want to go into? Like, what happens if has Tezos governance agreed that like Tenderbake is something we actually want to do? Or what happens if you do spend a year developing it and then governance says, no, we don't want to use it?
Yeah, so there needs to be better infrastructure for off-chain governance. One first step was the launch of a forum called Tezos Agora, which is meant precisely to discuss these type of things. The other thing that I think a few people have expressed interest for as a signaling contract, so that you can do signaling votes where people say like, I think this is a good idea. And it's not binding on anything, you know, it doesn't like trigger on-chain governance. It's just to like take the temperature of the room. So that's underdeveloped, but I think it is on the way.
This next question is for Sunny. Eric asks, can you discuss the state of Ethermint and other blockchains running mirrored versions on Cosmos?
Yeah, sure. So I would just say that the word mirror, just to clear up any misunderstandings, is we're not like sort of replaying. The state of Ethermint is not the same as the state of Ethereum. You know, you don't have the same tokens on, you know, we're not replaying transactions on both chains. So it's not mirrored in that sense. But what it is we turn the EVM into a module in the Cosmos SDK. So that way, if you want to sort of use a lot of the benefits of the Cosmos SDK to deploy your own chain, such as our staking system, our governance system, our consensus protocol, IBC, whatnot, but you still want to use your Solidity contracts, you can do that. And so this is sort of, for example, what Aragon is doing, where they want to make use of a lot of the stuff that, you know, the Cosmos SDK provides, but they've also spent years developing their Solidity contract. And so the Ethermint EVM module basically allows them to redeploy their contracts in their own chain. And that's sort of what the goal of Ethermint is. And Ethermint is coming along quite well. You can follow it on github.com/changesafe/Ethermint. That's where the core development is basically being done. And currently, you know, our testing process to make sure it works is we are replaying all the transactions from Ethereum onto an Ethermint instance just to make sure it all processes and works correctly. And so that's a good testing model. There are other smart contracting stuff also being built on the Cosmos SDK. So there's other frameworks such as Agoric. They're this sort of JavaScript object capability based smart contracting language. The other really good one is called Cosmwasm. So that is a WebAssembly based contracting framework so you can write contracts in Rust. And unlike, you know, a lot of things that say WebAssembly smart contracting, which is basically like, you know, it just runs WebAssembly code. This is actually a properly like smart contracting system that has rules for how WebAssembly contracts can talk to each other and all that. So it's actually like a full featured WebAssembly contracting system. So yeah, you can check out a bunch of those.
Okay, Tezos and Cosmos, this is a question from Sasha. What do you see as the main stepping stones that add the most value and enable vast real-world adoption? Someone want to go first?
The stepping stone, so like from a technological perspective, there are many angles to this question, but I think that a lot of value from this for this network is basically longevity. It's about being relevant for it's about being like safe and relevant for long periods of time. That's and it's a very and it's very hard to basically take a shortcut through that. I think what's important for Tezos is to demonstrate that it's capable of always being at the forefront of what's technologically possible, because a lot of the value of the governance mechanism is to say, hey, no matter what innovation come in, Tezos can basically catch up with all this innovation as a way of integrating it without going through hard forks or very, very disruptive operation on the chain. And I think one of the ways to demonstrate that for Tezos today is to keep integrating new technologies. And I think that's exemplified, for example, in there's an upcoming proposal which integrates zero-knowledge transactions for making private transactions on Tezos. And I think that's a good demonstration of that.
Yeah, for Cosmos, I would say some of the main stepping stones like coming up, you know, one is the deployment of IBC. I think the next main goal for Cosmos, you know, like I said, we've been focusing a lot on Cosmos for the past couple of years. I think after IBC is deployed, we want to spend a lot more time sort of really getting the Cosmos hub to be a valuable chain on its own. And so that means really putting a lot of effort into developing the shared security features of Cosmos, of the Cosmos hub. So that way, and this will help make it easier for new chains to be deployed on Cosmos, where they don't necessarily have to come with their own launch with their own validator set or proof of stake token. They can sort of lease security from the Cosmos Hub, and that will make it easier for new chains to be deployed. And then like when it comes to real world adoption, I mean, I think that's sort of the big question right now. I was talking about this earlier today with someone where, I think I started working on Cosmos because I was unhappy with like how Ethereum development works and just like the architecture of Ethereum. And, here we are 3 years later, and, the problems I set off to fix are kind of fixed now. We have the Tendermint core, we have Cosmos SDK, IBC is almost done. And so what I was saying to them was like, look, we have a lot of scalability. Now we just need to actually find some use for that scalability. And so, I don't know. I mean, I think, like I said, I personally think that the way forward in this is building DeFi, but that actually takes into account reputation systems and stuff. But there's a lot of people working on a lot of different things, and so it'll be interesting to see what actually gains adoption.
In terms of mass adoption, I also think that there's too much of a tendency for people to ignore that blockchains are going to have a lot of limitation and are going to have a lot of strengths. And I would not, if there's no benefit in using a decentralized system, I would not expect them to win over a centralized system. And so, and for most people, most people do not really, most people are very comfortable using centralized system. And there's a few cases where being decentralized, especially for the things which are very important to people, where the cost of like a centralized actor fucking up is not high. I think that's where it's going to pay off, but it's limited, and so it doesn't lend itself naturally to the mass adoption that you see, for example, with mobile phones, where all of a sudden overnight it's like, oh sure, mobile phone is great. It's really convenient. And if you look really at I think the core use case for this thing, which is a decentralized censorship resistant store of value, I think it's useful to a lot of people, but it's also a big paradigm change. Oftentimes, there's this graph that says like, oh look, adoption of new technologies goes faster and faster because it took a lot less longer for people to adopt smartphone than it took to adopt computers, for example. But when people were introduced to a smartphone, the value prop was almost immediate, and they didn't have to change that much. Look, let's look at mobile phones. Okay, you have a phone, now you can take the phone in your pockets. Very easy, almost no change of habit, very, very simple. Oh, now you know how you had internet on your computer and you had a phone, now you have internet on your phone. Very simple. And so it's normal that the adoption is very fast. It's kind of like looking at, oh, it took X many years for people to use television, but when there was color television, and immediately, well, yeah, like now you have all this TV program and so on and so forth. You go from black and white. You're talking about reinventing money and systems which have been in place for thousands and thousands of years. And so I think you're going to see a very, very different curve of adoption than the one you've seen for, yeah.
Yeah, people are so notoriously much more conservative with money than they are with pretty much anything else, to the point where when ATMs were introduced, you had to have people sitting next to the folks who were allegedly, replacing the teller and showing them how to punch through and not to be afraid. So there's definitely like also the fact that it's money and it's something that people are notoriously extraordinarily conservative about, factoring in there too.
And I think there's some good work in the development of like trying to help people handle key material, because again, the value of this thing is going to be primarily realized if the systems are custodial. And today, the reality is that people still have to deal with private keys. They're a great hardware wallet, but I think part of it is like better UX efforts on the part of our space, but also and there's not going to be any getting around it. Better also education on the part of the users. The UX is not going to do all the heavy lifting, unfortunately.
This is another question for Sunny. Is Cosmos still considering adding photons? And if not, what was the thought process to not move forward with them?
I mean, to be clear, photons were always sort of just a proposal. Like, it's more of like an idea, not anything like sort of hard commitment. I mean, I don't know. It was. I wouldn't say that they're like we're not doing them. It's sort of just a matter of really figuring out what it was. Really, what it was we wanted to have this sort of monetary experiment where it was just our way of saying like, hey, we're interested in exploring new monetary experimentation. And we were trying to do stuff, think about things around, constant issuance where like, the idea was we'd do 500 photons per hour till the end of time. Because that was like an issuance model that, wasn't really done before, except then Grin actually ended up doing it. And so I don't know. And the other thing that Photon was supposed to be was also is a token for Ethermint, which would be the fee token for Ethermint. Because as I mentioned, while the Cosmos SDK allows you to pay fees in any token you want, the EVM isn't really designed for doing that. And so thus it's a bit hard to do that with the Ethermint module as well. Or at least in the earlier versions of the Ethermint module. The thing is now it actually is easier to do it.
It's weird that the EVM has any concept of fee. I would understand doing gas accounting, but like, what does it care about?
Sorry. Yeah, so that's why I actually corrected myself. Where in the old version of Ethermint, that was an issue because the old version of Ethermint was just Go Ethereum running on top of Tendermint core. Yeah, but now the new version of Ethermint is actually just the EVM inside the Cosmos SDK. So you're right. Actually, it should actually be much more feasible to do that now. And so this is actually something we're looking into internally of potentially, how to deploy. We're trying to figure out how to deploy Ethermint and like what's the best way of going about doing that. Because there is a lot of demand for an Ethermint chain, but we're trying to figure out what's the, we're trying to avoid doing a token sale because we don't really want to do that. We did that, it's not a lot of fun. So we're trying to figure out what's the best way to sort of deploy this Photons and Ethermint, and so that basically stay tuned. You'll probably hear something within a couple of months.
Yeah, I do want to say that Photons, like insofar as the name of a token goes, it is definitely going to be happening. Although the the token mechanics that were originally proposed in the proposal may be a little bit different. And whether or not there's pre-mine or whether or not there's going to be a token sale, that's TBD. I don't think there's going to be any sort of like token sale, but Photons are going to be launched.
It's not a pre-mine if there's no mining.
Yeah.
Or maybe there will be. I don't know. Why not? Let's just throw a proof of work module on top of the Cosmos SDK. You submit proof of work, you get tokens.
I think there's something I've been thinking about for this. I think there's value in like having maybe 0.1%, 0.01% of issuance come from mining. Not because you care about the mining for security, and so that's inflation, that's a cost. But the benefit is that you do have it does give you a decentralized faucet. Decentralized. Faucet.
There could be like an airdrop associated with too. The pre-mine, whatever it may be, could also be airdropped to people who like hold Atom tokens or some other tokens if that's what they want Photons to become.
Question. Sorry, this is very unrelated, but it relates to current events in Cosmos, which is there's currently a governance proposal on the Cosmos Hub to essentially participate in the token sale of a chain in the Cosmos ecosystem. And they're a great community member team. Like they've done a lot of, support for Cosmos and develop stuff for the Cosmos SDK. Has these kind of proposals showed up on Tezos yet?
No, but so just so I understand, the proposal is basically they get some atoms and then atom holder get airdrops of new tokens or something like that?
Yeah, so in the Cosmos Hub, there is a community pool where some portion of rewards get automatically sent to this community pool, which can be spent that are meant to be spent for core infrastructure and protocol development. But yes, so the proposal is that, we use some atoms from the community pool to participate in the fundraiser, and then when the token launches, they will send their tokens over IBC back to the community pool.
Yeah, I haven't seen this proposal in Tezos. I think it's a fun experiment. It's a fun experiment. I think possibly one of the reasons you haven't seen that is, at least, when I was talking about Tezos, I've never really hidden that I was very, very skeptical of the app coin model, of having a coin for everything. And I think a lot of people who were interested in the Tezos project and who are involved in Tezos kind of shares that opinion. And as a result, I think it may be a bit of a hard sell for them to say like, oh, here's a governance. You're gonna, you're gonna get your Tezos is going to get diluted, but you'll get this other token. I think it might be. I don't know if you'd get like 80% of people to agree twice to that, but it's cool that it can be done. I think the idea is interesting. Kind of like this decentralized aspect is fun.
Arthur and Kathleen Brightman, Mark asks, after all the legal trials and tribulations you've been through, if you were launching Tezos today, would you do anything differently in terms of the organizational structure you architected?
Well, we didn't launch Tezos. I mean, what we did is we entered a contract with the Swiss Foundation. I guess the thing to the lesson is that Swiss business culture has a lot of idiosyncrasies.
Yeah, I mean, Ben Horowitz has like a little bit in The Hard Thing About Hard Things, which I recommend every entrepreneur to read, which is like, what, sometimes it's just one person who fucks everything up. And for us, it was like pretty much patient zero on that was Gevers, right? So just don't go into business with Johan Gevers or sign a contract with him because he will not honor it. That's like kind of our big takeaway. Yeah, I mean, it's a banal and not very generalizable lesson, but it is a lesson all the same.
Got it.
Is the generalizable, here's a generalizable takeaway. This is something that Bob Summerall likes to say, and I really liked it. And tell me if you guys think this is true. So in a lot of like almost every blockchain project, there's always drama. And the reason that it happened, so Bob Summerall's explanation is what's happening here is we're all building these hyper trustless protocols. But you know who wants to build hyper trustless protocols? People with trust issues. And so do you think that is like, not to like comment on Tezos specifically, but do you think that's just like a general thing in the space?
I would disagree.
I mean, I don't know what a trust issue is, but definitely like the communities that you see around this this project are very, very
Fair enough.
They're not a trusting bunch.
Well,
yeah.
And yet they are, right? Like, and yet they like sort of crave a lot of centralization too. Like, there's a lot of contradictions if you look at any of these communities, because they are so vast, and they, if it's a successful project, it pulls from a lot of different backgrounds, and so you find like flavors, and the people who have more time on their hands tend to be the ones who are like the craziest, and there's like a lot of dynamics that lead to very fraught and like sort of incoherent conversations and themes and narratives within any given community.
Yeah, I would say it's more of misplaced. Yeah, I guess it's not like lack of trust. It's really misplaced trust. It's very strange. Just like there's a phenomenon which is like, which I find mind-boggling. But like there's a category of people that says like whoever talks is whoever I'm going to is whoever I'm going to trust. And so one of the events with Gevers that like blew my mind is that for like months and months and months, all these horrible things, and like people come to understand like the guy is just like really fucking bad, and he writes one blog post, and people are like, "You're talking to us, all is forgiven, and yay, you're talking to us, finally communication, that's what we needed. Oh yes, now you can take us through the finish line." They're like, what?
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
Just because this guy is writing a blog post and somehow he has your trust, this is insane.
I mean, it's like battered spouses, right? And so it's really odd. Like, the more you communicate, the less people trust you. It tends, at least in the Tezos experience, right? Like, You know, it's a very odd dynamic. So I'm sure there's going to be an excellent, like, you know, range of sociology papers if this industry ever comes to any sort of notoriety. You know, trying to dissect the different ways that these things are bootstrapped and the ways that these narratives are forged. But you know, generally, I think, you know, what burned us is, like, there was a lot of, like, sort of social signals that, you know, we were latching onto when we went into business with Gevers, that, you know, turned out to be, I think, so here's what I would say. The Gevers would not survive in Silicon Valley, but he's right at freaking home in the crypto valley. So I think there was, like, a cultural sort of porting that we did that was not warranted. And had we, you know, maybe ordered a background check or done something a little bit more aggressive, other than ask his peer group, you know, it would have gone a different way.
Yeah, there's Silicon Valley due diligence and there's Switzerland due diligence, and it's not the same.
Yeah, he would not pass Silicon Valley due diligence.
No, the guy would have been an outcast. That's the thing. It's like we talked to a bunch of people, like, you know, we talked to his peer group. We talked to a lot of people.
We talked to people who worked with him. We talked to people who did business with him.
And then, like, oh yeah, Johan is great. And then, you know, and then after the you know, the shit hit the fan, you go to these people and like, oh yeah, Johan's the worst. Yes.
Everyone needs, what? How are you guys going to tell us that?
We didn't want to tell you because you thought you were his friend.
Yeah, whereas, like, Matt was, like, persona non grata in Silicon Valley because, like, he started 21, he got it into, like, the crap, and everyone knows not to touch him, you know? And so it's just, like, that's the way the cookie crumbles, where you have, like, very tight feedback loops, and people just, you know, don't feel bad about, like, telling you to watch out for someone. So we got burned pretty hard on that. I think it's made us far more cynical, which I didn't need as a native New Yorker, but in any case, there was a level I transcended to. And so that's kind of our big takeaway. But I mean, you know, in terms of, like, doing it all over again, I think, like, you know, the fact of the matter is today, Tezos is a really successful project, and we're really happy with how it came out. And, you know, I think I have more ulcers than I would have liked, but other than that, it's been like, you can't argue with the ecosystem that's emerged and the success of the project writ large.
Fair enough. Arthur and Kathleen, do you think we will have central banks in 100 years? If so, what might they look like?
Oh boy.
That's a tough question.
I don't know if there's going to be humans in 100 years. So, you know, let alone central banks. I mean, the risk of extinction is like per year. Even if you're, like, a pretty optimistic person and you're trying to, like, put the risk of catastrophic events, you know, between, like, asteroids and pulsars and AI and plagues and so on and so forth, is, like, high enough that it's really, really hard to make, like, predictions 100 years out. But I guess we can make a conditional prediction saying, like, you know, assuming that none of these, like, horrible catastrophic events happen, you know, basically, like, you see no more catastrophic events than you've seen over the past 100 years, and you look at the next 100 years. Do we have central banks? Well, I'm going to go with no, and it's overused. You know, people really over-index on it, but I'm going to use a Lindy effect and say that central banks have not been there for a very long time. They've been there for just 100 years, and so, you know, a base assumption for, like, their longevity is another 100 years. And so I would bet that I would bet on the side of no.
Yeah. I mean, you know, in 100 years, humans are dead, humans are on Mars, or we would have had a financial revolution and destroyed the central banks, and everything's running on cryptocurrency. I don't think any central bank is going to be destroyed. I think these things basically tend to wither as opposed to. They wither into irrelevance. You mean?
Yeah.
I'll say not for 100 years because, like you said, like, it's just too hard to predict. But I think, like, if we look on the time scale of maybe 20 to 50 years, I think that we're going to still have central banks, but they're going to look very. Their role is going to be very different than they are today. I think that central banks are going to shift more and more towards sort of standards institutions where, you know, my dream is I want a world where central banks output dictionary units of accounts, kind of like the Chilean central bank does today, where they have this unit of account called the Unidad de Fomento. It's just a index that's, like, just pegged to inflation, that's, like, against inflation, and So if you go to the supermarket and you want to buy potatoes, like, the prices are all in Chilean pesos, but your rent and your, your car payment, all like long-term payments are all in UF. And I think we're going to move to a world where the role of central banks is basically going to be institutions that sort of measure the state of the economy and output indices that people point against.
I'm a huge fan of that as well, and it basically destroys the Keynesian arguments for like basically giving governments power to print money, because really at the end of the day, like the basis of all this is to saying that there's rigidity in the price system, and okay, then you have rigidity in the price system, address the rigidity in the price system. Don't do this horrible hack where somehow the way you're going to address the price system is by printing money. That's insane. Like the way you do it is dictionary money, like you described. So one thing I know for sure is, like, I think there are going to be a lot fewer central banks in the next, but that's an easier prediction to make. And I don't think, I don't think cryptocurrencies compete with like the very large currencies like the US dollar or the euro or anything like that. They compete primarily with scrappy currencies, and there's a lot of those.
Do you think there's going to be a lot fewer or a lot more, or about the same nation states?
I think we'll see the equivalent of dollarization or other formulas in other countries, or the central banks will be less prominent. They'll basically maintain a bunch of foreign reserves and issue basket currencies based on foreign reserves. We'll see a lot of that.
Yeah.
All right, we are almost here at 2 hours. Sorry, I've been going dark and light because I've been changing rooms. Laptop losing power.
What do you mean changing room? We all just see the nice black hole and Cosmos behind you.
That's planned. That's right. Okay.